Hello everyone, welcome to GoGuardian's first ever live stream all about how to start your suicide prevention plan at your school or district. We're so grateful that you're here. We know that you operate on the front lines of youth suicide prevention and we welcome you. We also want to thank our co-host, the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, for joining us today. My name is Michelle Ramos. I'm our Strategic Initiatives Manager for GoGuardian. For those of you who may not be familiar with us, we are the #1 fastest growing educational technology company with the mission of supporting students in every aspect of their learning, fueling curiosity, and equipping educators with state-of-the-art tools. In the fall, we are going to be releasing a tool called Beacon, which will identify and escalate students who have been interacting with, creating, or searching for content related to suicide so that school-based mental health professionals can get them the help that they need. We've spent the last year learning from experts around the country about suicide prevention and this space, and we figured you might like the opportunity to learn from them as well. So we are going to be talking with our panelists today about suicide prevention and the considerations that you may need to think about as you start to develop your plan. So why don't we go ahead and get started. Doreen, can you start us off with your introduction?
Sure. I'm Dr. Doreen Marshall, and I'm the Vice President of Programs for the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. I'm also a psychologist by training, and I got my start in suicide prevention work just over 15 years ago, actually on the postvention end, so responding to schools after there had been a suicide death. And now I work with AFSP kind of on our education programs, our school-based education, our model school policy, and other programs that we have that really span the lifespan in suicide prevention.
Jonathan, can you introduce yourself?
Sure, I'd be happy to. My name's Jonathan Singer. I'm an associate professor of social work at Loyola University, Chicago. I'm the founder and host of the Social Work Podcast, secretary of the American Association of Suicidology, co-author of the 2015 text, Suicide in Schools. And I have been working with suicidal kids and their families since 1996. When I was working at a mobile crisis unit in Austin, Texas, and I drive around all day doing risk assessments with suicidal, homicidal, and actively psychotic kids. Thanks for having me, Michelle.
Thank you. Sandy, why don't you introduce yourself?
Thank you, Michelle. I'm Sandy Austin. I'm a counselor. I've been a counselor for 22 years, a school counselor in high schools. And I am the crisis facilitator for the Professional Interest Network at the American School Counselor Association. And what's sad is when we become an expert in something like this, that means we've had a lot of involvement with it. So my first traumatic thing that I really experienced was 3 suicides in 1 month of students from my school, and then another one 7 months later. So really got into it heavily right at the beginning.
Thank you. Thank you all for joining us. Again, I want to remind our audience that you can also type in questions into the YouTube comment box. You can also enter questions into Facebook Live, or also you can tweet questions to the hashtag suicide prevention webinar, or suicide prevention live stream, excuse me. Great, so I want to kind of start off with a little bit of an assessment of this industry, and I want to start with Doreen. What have you seen change over the last 30 years of the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention's existence, especially in the role of schools?
Yeah, I think a lot has changed. I think schools are not new to crisis planning, and they have not been, over time. They've always had some sort of crisis plan, whether it's the plan for bomb threats or those sorts of things. But what's changed is over the last, I'd say, 5 to 10 years, you've seen a real focus on suicide prevention and suicide response being its own distinct part of those plans, and in some cases its own plan. The other thing is technology has completely changed the way we do things. So it has required a quicker response because often students will find out from each other things long before it makes it to the attention of adults, and technology has only fueled that. And I think the last thing that's changed is that we have now seen more legislation that's required teachers and others in schools to receive suicide prevention training. So it kind of expands the responsibility to include schools, but it, kind of emphasizing that shared responsibility among parents, schools, and others in the community to help detect suicide and try and prevent it.
Thank you. Jonathan, what are some of the common struggles or questions that you receive as you work with schools?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think, Doreen hit on some really important points, which is that the crisis teams that were developed initially to address, active shooter threats or natural disasters, the schools wonder, how can we convert these and use these for suicidal crises, which is exactly the right question to ask, right? They also have questions about how to manage the use of technology, right? Do we have a responsibility as a school to monitor youth outside of school? Do we have a responsibility when you have two kids who are interacting from different schools or possibly different school districts? What do we do with elementary schools, right? So these are all questions that come up on a regular basis when I'm working with schools.
Thank you. Sandy, I know that you've taken this on through the American School Counselor Association. I'm curious if you could tell us a little bit about how you've seen schools really take this on as part of their responsibility.
What's interesting is a lot of the practices through the years was we were really focusing on the adults. We've got to prepare the adults. We've got to train them to see the signs and everything, which we do. We definitely do. But as Doreen was saying, on the social media, the kids know a lot before the adults do. And so that's where if we can rally the kids to be able to have their the eyes out there and their ears out and they're open to know what's going on with their friends and their peers, then they'll be able to be our first people that can respond and let us know, let the adults know. Then we can get that process going. But the kids, we need to rally the kids and give them help teach the empathy and everything to be aware of what's going on around them with their peers.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you. And so over the last year, we've really learned that it takes a whole village. It takes everybody to really rally behind this issue, to really holistically support students in their moment of need. I'm curious, Jonathan, could you kind of detail for us some of the main components of a very complete plan?
Sure. Well, you can't think about responding effectively in a school without understanding what to do at the district level.
Right.
And so obviously this changes based on how large your school district is and how many schools you have. But you need to make sure that even if the people at the school site are trained, they also need to be aware of what the resources are if they need extra support. If they need to call in other folks. So the basic communication principles are key, right? You should use the incident command structure that the federal government established that works really well for crisis events. You need to make sure that you have people in place to address things such as interacting with the media, particularly when you have a suicide death of a popular student. And somebody that people are like, wow, we never imagined, right? The media is going to be very interested. It's a hot news story. And so how do you respond to that? You need to make sure somebody's communicating with the students. There's one person that's involved with addressing the teacher's needs, a community liaison. All of these things are essential for a plan. And any plan has to be practiced. Right? You can't just write something down and then expect people to be able to spring into action when an event happens because, as Sandy said in the beginning, suicide deaths are traumatic, right? And so you're not expecting people to be able to think creatively. And you certainly don't want people to kind of riff when something like this happens. So setting aside the time to plan and to practice is essential. Different scenarios could include a suicide attempt in the school building. What happens when you have an 8th grader in a middle school who's got an older sibling in a high school and a younger sibling in an elementary school? What happens if you have a suicide death a couple days before the start of the school year? What if it's a transfer student that nobody knows versus the star quarterback, right? All of these things need to be thought of in advance so that the school can prepare.
Great, thank you for that. Doreen, I'm curious, what are some of the decisions and trade-offs that schools need to consider when they're developing their plan, especially in light of technology such as our tool?
Well, I agree with everything that Jonathan said, and I would probably just add and emphasize this importance of communication and role clarification, kind of in real time, who is going to respond, who needs to be consulted. If you imagine some of the ways this could play out, if you learn of a suicide attempt over the weekend, school starts on Monday, who's the first person that reaches out if the student is there, if the student is not there? So really thinking through those different permutations. I think also with respect to Beacon and this idea of getting an alert during the school day, school's a busy place where lots of other stuff is happening. So I think just being very clear on whose role is to reach out to the student, to communicate to others, if the district needs to be notified in the instance where an attempt happens in a building, for example. Just thinking through all of those things and then making sure that the communication and consultation happens quickly and it's clear who's doing what.
Great, thank you for that. And Sandy, I think it's really important, we've heard so much again about the village effect, and who in your school community do you partner with to ensure that the student gets the help that they need?
One of the big things is there are 5 counselors within my department here at my school, and so we partner up with each other. If we need to bounce something off them, we're just always aware of what's happening and seeing if we know something's going on and there's an attempt or a suicidal student or something like that, we're supporting each other. And just, for example, if I have to go and get go and get an administrator to come in, I tell my secretary to make sure that kid doesn't leave and that type of thing. So we need to be working with teachers, with secretaries, with our cafeteria workers. We have to be working with them all, because realizing that these kids have connections with all those different people. And so we've got to work together as a team when we're dealing with these types of situations. School resource officers, the campus police officer, if you have one on your campus, parents, we need to have the parents involved. Sometimes the parents are the reason for suicidal ideation. So that's where we have to be careful about that. We need to be reaching out to the community outside of our schools. If we're in a larger city, maybe be working with the mental health center. We got to have a connection there. And the faith community, they've been a big part in some of our outreaches. When we had the 4 suicides at my school several years ago, they were a very important part.
Thank you for that. Absolutely. I want to also kind of dive in on this other aspect where, we all know that mental health and suicide in particular generally comes with a pretty heavy and negative stigma. And so I know that that's important to GoGuardian in terms of just starting more conversations. Doreen, how should schools make sure that everyone is part of the solution, including parents?
That's a great question. I think just making sure that once your district develops a plan, or if you have a plan, that parents are also clear on what happens if their child is suicidal. There's a lot of misinformation out there about what happens if someone expresses suicidal ideation, and that's not just limited to schools, but making sure they have a real sense of what the school will do, what they won't do, and also, just making sure they're aware of what the plan is. Many parents and others do not think about this until it's right in front of them. So I think anything you can do to proactively communicate that is really helpful.
Great. And Doreen, I wanted to know if you could kind of give us a little bit of a synopsis of maybe some of the steps that a parent might take if they were to, find out that their student might be suicidal.
So, I mean, certainly, not to wait maybe is the most important thing. That if you get information, to not assume this is a phase or something that's going to go away. Certainly, I would advise them to start by talking with their child and saying, I understand, I've learned this. However they came to the understanding, if they're unsure, to certainly ask directly. But I think the more important thing is to also not leave the school out of the communication. So, it's perfectly okay for them to call a school counselor and say, hey, over the weekend I had this conversation with my son and I wanted to put this on your radar, that I'm concerned about him, to bring them into that communication so that they can be a resource to parents as well. And then certainly to connect to mental health support and not to wait. Again, that's probably the most important message. I think we all tend to assume this is a phase, it may go away. But if they learn that their child is writing about suicide, talking about suicide, or they just have a hunch that something's not right, it's really important to follow up and get further assessment.
Great, thank you. Amazing. Jonathan, I'm curious. One of the questions that we get a lot also is, how do you generally respond when a school or a community member responds to developing a suicide prevention plan with hesitation or with worry about legal liability?
Yeah, I mean, legal liability is a huge issue, and every time I talk to a school administrator, that's the first thing on their mind. They think, well, so if we open up the topic, if we start asking kids if they've had thoughts of killing themselves, aren't we now responsible for anything that happens afterwards? And isn't it better if we just don't ask? Well, and the answer to that is no. It's not better if you don't ask, because it's going to happen, right? The Youth Risk Behavior Survey suggests that about 17% of high school students in the United States will report at least one serious thought of suicide in the next year. And so thinking about legal liability is all about understanding what the reasonable person would do. And so the reasonable person is a legal concept. And if you talk to administrators and you say, look, we have ideas about what is reasonable to do in response to suicide risk today. One thing that's reasonable to do is to screen. But the second thing is to make sure that you have established collaborators outside in the community that can respond to suicide risk. And it's reasonable to ask questions and then follow up and make sure that the kids are getting the support they need, maybe more intensive assessment, maybe intervention. And that if you are doing those things, you are not going to be liable for failure to act. Now, this is different than ethics, right? Those are issues and sort of morality and how people feel about things. But what we know from lawsuits is that school districts are rarely held entirely liable for a suicide death. The only time that things that go south for school districts is when they do not do what a reasonable person would have done in that situation. And again, what is reasonable to do in this day and age is to ask the questions, to provide the referrals, to maintain open lines of communication, and to make sure that there is somebody in your school whose job it is to be up on this topic.
Thank you. Absolutely. I'm curious, we had a question. I'm curious, in terms of developing a plan and addressing that plan, how do you know who should be involved in setting up a suicide prevention plan? Are PTAs ever involved? Jonathan, can you kind of comment on that?
Yeah, so every school district does it differently. There are some school districts that already have kind of community advisory boards, right, where you have people that are community members, both professionals and paraprofessionals and folks like that. So you might have somebody from the local hospital or from the community mental health, or somebody who represents religious or faith communities. If sports tends to be outsourced in terms of community leagues, so you might have a community group like that that includes parents and sometimes students, right? Mm-hmm. So that is totally a reasonable thing to do, to have this community input. because suicide prevention in schools has to include the community, right? There's only so much that a school can do. The school can't do everything. It also shouldn't do nothing. But if a school doesn't have a community advisory panel, right, if they don't have a task force, they shouldn't wait to develop something until that gets together, because every community has different needs. I've worked in communities where there are very few resources. The parents are working 3 jobs. They don't have time to go to a 7 o'clock meeting on a Tuesday because they have no childcare, right? So you don't want to wait until that happens. You have to be realistic about your community. If you can get it, great. But you should still get your plan going, whether or not you have community input.
Great, thank you.
Michelle, if I could piggyback on something Jonathan's saying, because I think this is really important, that these plans can't be developed in isolation from the community in which they exist. So even understanding how your mental health system works in your community. In other words, if your policy says a student needs an assessment before they return to school, and you know in your community a student can't get an assessment quickly, or that assessment needs to be done by the emergency room, these are the kinds of things that schools need to kind of be aware of and kind of craft a policy around that. And I think having other community stakeholders even give input sometimes is a way to know that. The other thing, just going back to the liability question, because I think this is an important one, is one of the things schools can do as just a good faith effort, aside from liability, is really train their staff. And we have some training programs at AFSP. We have a More Than Sad program that does training for students, teachers, and school staff and parents, but really kind of training that community about suicide so that schools aren't feeling like they're the only stakeholders with the information.
Absolutely. Yeah. Go ahead, Jonathan.
And if I can jump in also, Doreen's right on about all of this. And, you know, thinking about liability, if you are a school district and you are taking this example of like a kid has to have a mental health assessment before they come back, if that's just based on something that you read or you overheard at a conference, that's not necessarily meeting the reasonable person standard. Because if the kid has identified that the only place they feel safe and the only place where they don't have active suicidal ideation is in school, then you're actually increasing their risk by requiring them to not be in school until they get an assessment. And so it really is a topic that you have to think through for your students, from the clinical to the policy. You know, the American Association of Suicidology has the school certification program, and it's another program, just like what Doreen was saying about the More Than Sad through AFSP. There are resources out there that have been developed for schools that schools can take advantage of. They're out there right now.
Absolutely. Sandy, I'm curious, I'm going to kind of go to you now. How, in your school or in your experience with the American School Counselor Association, have you been able to rally parents and students to support a suicide prevention planning process or identification and intervention processes on school campuses as they are stakeholders in this problem?
Very important. I had mentioned earlier that we need to rally the students, and after the 4 suicides at my school, what we had done is I had talked with the students, I talked with the families of those young men, and I was trying to find out what were they going through, and various levels of mental illness. Some even, excuse me, were hospitalized or had just been out for extended illnesses or new to a school. And so the thing is that when they went through some of these kind of life experiences, being new to a school, a lot of times we don't know why they're new to the school. Did they lose a parent? Did something happen? Did they get expelled? Why were they expelled? Finding out these reasons and that type of thing. Kids that were out for extended illnesses, if they were hospitalized, why were they hospitalized? And so what I did is, as a result of all that, I started a club called the Bionic team, which stands for Believe It or Not, I Care. And what it does is we reach out to new students, to kids out with extended illnesses, to kids that lose loved ones, to kids that are bullied. And what we do is we empower the kids to reach out. So it's the kids reaching out to each other, and they know that someone cares they're at school, that they are seen, that they are valued. And that's where so often kids in isolation, that's when they start thinking about suicide, when they think no one cares. Who cares if I'm not at school or whatever? And so that's where, by rallying the kids to reach out to each other, that's where we've seen they've been able to change the climate of a school to a caring climate, and to really make a difference and put that support network, that net under those kids to say, it does matter that if I'm here at school or not. People notice when I'm not here, so I am important, I am valued. So that's what we've seen as very, very important.
I think that's really relevant, and I think we actually have a question as a follow-up to that. Do you ever communicate or involve students themselves in the suicide prevention plan development?
I can speak for experience what happened with the 4 suicides at my school. What happened was the 3 of them were within a month. And so then what we did is, it was in November, December, right before the holidays, when we were just reeling from that. When we came back to school, the counselors went into every English classroom, because we knew we could hit every student had to have English. And so we went in there and we said, you guys, a month ago, there were 3 guys walking through our halls. They're not here anymore. And we said, we found out through time that they had mentioned something to their friends, maybe not specific suicide, but who cares if I'm here anymore, or whatever, things like that. And so what we did is we involved the kids. We said, you guys, we need to know when your friends are talking about suicide. You guys don't have the experience, the training, we do. But they said, well, but I don't want to break the confidence of my friend. I don't want my friend to get mad at me. And what happened in one of those sessions within the English classroom, one of the kids in the back of the room said, well, I don't want my friend to get mad at me. The girl, we had a student council student with us that went into the classrooms, and she said, you know what? That's what I thought. She said, I knew the 3rd guy. And she said, he said something about, suicide in a roundabout way. And she said, I thought, well, I'm not going to say anything because I don't want him to get mad at me. She said, now I'd rather have a mad friend than a dead friend. And so that's where we started a confidential tip box, and we had told the kids, let us know when your friends are struggling. We can help them. You can be the support behind them, with them while they're getting the help. And so that was what we found in reaching out to those kids.
Great, thank you.
I would just add that it's important that we think about this from the perspective that if I were a student and I knew of a friend of mine was struggling, who am I going to tell? And I think we have to make sure that any adult that gets this information knows what to do with it, because they may not take it directly to the counselor. They may take it to the bus driver or to the person they interact with every day. Maybe they don't even know the school counselor. So I think just reiterating that students will take it to who they're comfortable with, and that every adult in the school environment should know what to do with that information once they get it. And that's the importance of having a really good policy and good communication standards around that.
Absolutely. I know that a lot of schools actually try to send information home with students about suicide prevention, best practices, and things like that. And so I'm curious, is there ever, Jonathan, how would you assess this if a school is sending home information to parents? Is there a risk that parents may misinterpret or just redistribute that information shared and potentially get it wrong, or kind of interpret it inconsistently or incorrectly?
I think that the biggest risk of sending information home is that the parents won't get it. Honestly, I think that is the number one problem, especially when you have kids coming home with 2 or 3 hours of homework, and they've got this thing coming up, and they've got that thing, and then there's this other thing. I really do think that when schools are addressing suicide risk, they need to think about all of the multiple channels in which they are disseminating information. I think that schools need to have social media channels so that they can provide information, not just after a suicide event, but before, so that the parents and the students know that this is a place that understands the issue, that has the right messaging, that knows how to communicate, and that because they know the right things to say, that they're more likely that the students and the parents are more likely to reach out to the school and trust what they have to say when there is a suicidal crisis. I think that having community events where you have somebody come and give 15, 20-minute talk about some topic related to suicide. It could be, what to say to your kid if you're concerned that they're suicidal. How do you ask the question about suicide? What are some myths and facts about suicide, right? Have that, and then have a structured discussion with the parents and their students about this topic. So that the parents can ask the questions and they can provide feedback to the school about things that they're interested in. I know that this takes resources, but it's not a reasonable thing for a school district to say, we sent home information that was copied on a blue sheet of paper that had a little ribbon attached to it, right? Like that doesn't work. That doesn't work these days. So you have to think about other ways to communicate. And it's possible that Sandy has other more specific responses to that question. But I think those are that the most important thing is not that parents will misunderstand, but that they won't get it in the first place.
Do either of you have any additional comments to add to that question about sharing information with parents?
Yeah, I think Jonathan's right that we got to reach them in several different ways, through email, through information meetings, things like that. Back to school night, you could have kind of a parent academy. Some schools have that where they have 15-minute sessions, how to communicate with your kid, how to make sure they're, taking care of their health, different issues like that, and then have something about suicide or mental health of the kids or what are the issues that kids are facing today and how to be able to parent them. So I think that's very true. Through social media, that's important. Send something by email, various ways of getting things out. School newsletter. A lot of times administrators will send out a school newsletter on the website, different things like that. So you got to reach out to all the different media outlets so that or different types of media so that the parents will be able to get the information.
Great. So we are getting lots of questions, so I want to kind of wrap up this section of our live stream today. And at this point now, we are going to kind of open up to audience questions so that we can really start to hone in on some of the specific ideas, struggles, issues that schools are running into. So one of them, I know, Doreen, that the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention and the Trevor Project and the National Association of School Psychologists and the American School Counselor Association all put together a model school policy, a model school district policy. But I'm curious if perhaps even after our live stream today, but if you all could share a little bit about how maybe these model school policies could differ based on large districts versus small districts, in terms of what a good suicide prevention plan would look like for those varying sizes. Doreen, you want to start us off with that?
Yeah, I'll start, and I'd be curious to hear what Jonathan and Sandy would think about this as well. I think Jonathan's point about resources is not a small one. I think, one of the things our model school policy, and I appreciate you mentioning our partners that we've worked on that with, one of the things, it's kind of a guide, or I think of it as like a bit of a template, but the idea is schools are going to take that information and really tailor it based on what resources they have, what they think is realistic, how their communication channels work. So, I think that's something that has to be thought about. The other thing is, I think, depending on how far upstream a school has dealt with mental health issues, if they're a school who's regularly done programming, chances are they're going to have a ready environment for this kind of communication, but they may not. And so I think thinking about what pieces of training need to happen, not only about the policy itself, but also about anything that people need to know about suicide or mental health to help them be equipped to carry out the policy. Those sorts of things I think may differ depending on the school, whatever preparation they've done to date, and like we mentioned earlier, whatever existing crisis plans they already have in place.
And I just want to throw out that in terms of districts of different sizes or schools of different size, If you have a large school district, maybe you have a couple of high schools that each have 4,000 kids, and then you have, 6 middle schools, and then you have like 20 elementary schools or something like that, you would think about organizing resources differently than if you just had 3 elementary schools, a middle school, and a high school, and the middle school and the high school were next to each other, right? One of the things that Forefront, which is a program out of the University of Washington that has been working on kind of the organizational structure of how to train schools in suicide prevention, they came up with this idea of establishing cohorts in larger districts, right? Where you might have, if you have 2 high schools, and so you have 1 high school and then 3 of the middle schools and then 10 of the elementary schools in 1 cohort, and then the others in another cohort. You could have 3 or 4, whatever. And these become their partners, right? To share information, to call on when they need other staff to come in. And so that's not something that you would have to do in a smaller district. Likewise, in a smaller district, everybody's going to know each other, right? Mm-hmm. In a way that they're not mm-hmm. in a big district. And, Sandy can speak to this. Being in a school is all about knowing people, right? You know the person, like you can tell by looking at the assistant principal what is going on, right? They don't even have to tell you because you know them. You know the character of the principal just by walking into the school, right? So all of these things play a part in a suicide prevention plan that might vary from large to small in terms of the district. The other thing that I'm going to say is that regardless of the size of the school, you have to know how to accurately determine whether a suicidal crisis should be responded to at the school level, or enlarge it to the district level, right? And whatever mm-hmm. other levels there might be in between, because you don't want to over-respond. Because if you over-respond and you have 100 service providers show up to a school and you didn't need that, you're going to freak out the kids. They're going to be like, oh my God, maybe this is much worse than we thought it was. Likewise, you don't want to under-respond. You don't want to have the 3 school counselors completely wiped out after day 1, knowing that they're going to have to respond on days 2, 3, and 4, because that's not going to be good for anybody else.
Gotcha. Sandy, anything to add to that?
I just think what's important is I think of some of the smaller schools and that type of thing where the smaller districts. It's important, as John was talking about, a cohort. You need to be in touch with the other schools in your area, in your region. And if there's something going on, put the call out and say, hey, you guys, we could use some help. We just had this situation. And what's important is in those rural communities, this community has relatives in this other community, so they're all impacted in that whole area because they get together for rodeos and all that type of thing. In Colorado, we have those. Those you California people may not know that, but so it's important to just think of all of the connections that are out there that you guys have, and so that and people are willing to help, and it's amazing. And don't forget, like a lot of those cafeteria workers and those custodians and some of those guys, they can be very important with these kids and with the support all the way around. And so that's important to think of everyone that is impacted and that has information,
Absolutely.
Needs information.
So we did have a question actually about the Bionic team, Sandy, and so I'm curious if you could share a little bit more information about that, and then potentially we can kind of gather additional info from you after the fact. Could you kind of give us a little synopsis of how you got that started and where's it going?
You bet. Well, thank you. So it's amazing. Just in knowing what those kids had gone through, I realized that if as school counselors, we're dealing with, when we hear there's a loss of a loved one, some of these different things, we respond, but a lot of times we don't hear until after the fact. If a kid was hospitalized sometime, we don't hear about that until a week later. And so the kids know what's going on. And so the kids, we have individual teams within the Bionic team, a new student team, extended illness team, a loss team, Prevent Bullying by Just Saying Hi initiative, and those different teams. And so we have basically monthly outreaches for students that lose loved ones, just to let them know we understand that they're going through a tough time, and just to honor that person that they lost. New student breakfasts, we have one each month for the new students that come in. Two of the kids that took their lives, they were new to our school, and one needed to get involved. He had been involved with some substance abuse issues in the other school. His parents are wanting him to get on the basketball team. He was a good basketball player. Initially, when he came in, who was the first group that reached out to him? You know, those kids in that were dealing with a lot of substances, and so he never did get involved with basketball, and that could have helped him. And so that's where we have initial very, very basic outreaches, not a lot of training for the kids. The kids just want to care. We say, who do you care? Do you want to make a difference in someone's life? They can get more information at bionicteam.org. That's our website. So there's some more information there if they would like some more.
Thanks, Sandy. We had another question pushing again on that small school issue. You know, are there suggestions, maybe Doreen, you can kind of take this question, are there suggestions for resources in terms of schools with like less than 100 students, with no counselor or staff, and limited funding to obtain training?
I think that's a great question, and certainly, like I said, none of these conversations are separate from resources. One of the things I should say, just to back up a bit, is that, you know, remember when we're thinking about developing school policy and school plans, those are going to look different if you're responding to a suicide death, or the student comes on your radar as having suicidal, versus a completed suicide or a suicide death. Those are going to look different, and they may have overlap with other student death policies, for example. But in response to this question, I think one of the things, you know, just to be mindful of is that you don't have to reinvent the wheel. There's training out there. We have AFSP, we have chapters in all 50 states. Our chapters routinely provide training at no cost to the schools. You know, so I would just encourage you, and just put a little plug, if you go to afsp.org/chapters, you can find where the chapter near you is. And if your school is really strapped for resources, do not be afraid to reach out. And AFSP is one of many organizations that's involved in school-based suicide prevention. So just to not be afraid to enlist those community partners, but also those national partners that do this work every single day.
Absolutely.
You know, can I just throw out something real quick? So small schools, they can be schools that are small because there are not many kids around, and maybe they're low-resourced areas. But there are also small private schools, right, where you have kids that they could be parochial, they could be other things. I think that one of the things that people forget is that when folks have insurance, there's a 1-800 number that can be called, and they should call that number in advance to find out what are some of the services that the insurance company will cover in terms of mental health services, and to come up with a plan in advance about what are the resources that are available that our students already have access to. Because schools can't reinvent the wheel, but they certainly shouldn't be addressing issues that somebody else is already covering.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great point. Lots of new information there. I'm curious, we had a question about how would the positive behavioral interventions and supports program and kind of program really play a role here in suicide prevention. Jonathan, do you think you have any comments on that?
You know, I mean, PBIS is it's a philosophy, right? It's used in a lot of schools, and if you're using a behavior modification approach in your school, you need to make sure that your suicide prevention education and planning fits with that, right? In the sense that if kids are getting, say, gotchas, right, little tokens for doing something like applauding a classmate for saying something nice to somebody else, right? Or for catching them being good, those sorts of things. To think about how that fits in with what we know to be effective in suicide prevention, which is creating school as a safe place, a place where where students feel like staff recognize when they're doing well and that they're there to be supportive. And so those absolutely can fit in. But if you take sort of a suicide prevention program and you don't connect it to the philosophy that the teachers and the administrators are using in the school, then it's going to be a disconnect. You know, you have folks like Jim Mazza, past president of the American Association of Suicidology, who's been working with Marsha Linehan and colleagues to develop a universal curriculum based on dialectical behavior therapy skills. It's a universal curriculum that looks at everything from like emotion regulation to distress tolerance. And it is modifiable so that you could work it in with a PBIS framework if that's what you did. But if you don't have to, right? So this is just echoing what Sandy and Doreen have said. Like, it's all about making it fit for your school.
Thank you. Absolutely. We also have a pretty hefty question. How do you combat the difficulty of the thin line between giving a child their privacy and being so involved in their lives that you know the minute something is off? Our question our questioner here has said that many parents in their school district don't want to invade the privacy of their student and may miss signs. Doreen, do you have any comments on that?
I think it's a very complicated question, clearly, and probably says a lot more about what norms the school and the parents have around this to begin with before you even get to the topic of suicide. But, you know, one of the things I just want to keep reiterating is suicide at its core is a health issue. I mean, we are really looking at this, whether you think of it as mental health connected, which we know there's a strong connection, or life stressor connected, however you see that framework. You know, we should be thinking about this the same way we think of other health issues. So how long would we give a student their privacy if we thought they were walking on a broken foot, for example? You know, where would we cross that line and say, hey, you know what, I think that might be more serious and let's go get that checked out? I do think, and I don't mean to make light of this because I realize this is nuanced and incredibly difficult, but to think about it the way you would approach other health issues. And I think when schools and parents and others kind of get hung up on, you know, suicide is different, they forget that at its core, we address it the same way we address other concerns about student health. And if we could kind of keep that in mind, I think it will help guide behavior going forward.
Absolutely. Jonathan, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, so we know that parents who monitor their kids appropriately, that the kids have better outcomes than kids who are not monitored by their parents. And monitoring looks different depending on how old the kid is. So it's totally appropriate for me to basically know everything that's going on with my 6-year-old's life. It's less appropriate for me to insist that my 10-year-old leave her door open all the time and I sit in there with her 24/7, right? And as she gets older, as the kids get older, you want to have greater autonomy. But what that means is that you have to have spent time finding out how these kids are spending their time. You have to assess what it is that they're saying, how they're saying it, how they're interacting, what their responses are, especially when it comes to technology. Kids are always going to be more tech savvy. They're going to think of new ways to hack technologies, but adults are always going to be more socially savvy. They're going to have a better understanding of social dynamics. And suicide is a health issue, and it's also a social issue, right? So that when we're talking about the sense of isolation or being a burden to others or being rejected, that's social. That's inherently interpersonal. And so if as little kids, we're monitoring and we're saying, oh, okay, well, this is appropriate, this is not appropriate. Then when kids get older, we can have a better sense of what we need, when we need to intervene, and where we need to intervene, and how we need to monitor. And I think programs like GoGuardian that do monitoring of the text and the searches and all those sorts of things are an amazing tool that schools can use to better start to understand what at the moment might be a hidden layer of communication.
Thank you for that. Sandy, would you have anything to add to that question?
I'm sorry, a phone call was just coming in and I just missed some of that.
No problem. So the question is, in terms of this line between understanding a student, and honoring a student's privacy, but also knowing and understanding when a student's behavior might be different and may indicate suicidality. What's your opinion on that, and kind of how far should parents go?
You bet. I think, and that's the key about parenting. If your kids know you really care about them, really love them, then sometimes you will have to push. I have a situation with a former student that I've been dealing with that she's been trying to avoid me because she's been going through some difficult things. She thought I'd be disappointed in her, and I said no. And so parents, just be gentle and just keep on them as far as just letting them know you care and you're sensing something's going on, and just keep your eyes open. What's interesting is different times when I have conversations with parents and students, and we're wondering, okay, is this for show? Is this to get attention? Or is there really something going on here? We always take the risk and take it seriously, and to get them the help, if the parents aren't sure, but there are some signs there, I'd say get them evaluated, get them in there, because you don't want to think, oh, I don't think it's anything big, and then something happens. So, and if you've developed that relationship with your student, with your child, and they know you care and you're just doing this because you don't want to lose them, and to have those conversations that, honey, I'm sorry if I upset you, but you're showing some signs, and I think I want to be here to help you.
Along those lines, actually, we have a really good question I'm sure all of you can comment on. But the question is, what are some of the biggest signs that students, teachers, administrators, parents, etc., should look out for in a suicidal person? And what is the best way they should bring attention to that issue? Doreen, you want to start us off?
Yes, I think all of us could talk.
I was going to say, we probably all could jump.
Doreen, you want to
So
start
let me
us
just
off?
say, I'll just say, the first thing is hearing those words, right? I don't think anybody cares about me. I don't think, I don't know if I want to stick around. I'm not going to be here next year. And I'm being, these are sort of the more vague ones. The more obvious ones are, I'm thinking of killing myself. I've got a way of, that I'm going to kill myself, right? So taking those words seriously, if we were able to just ring a bell and from now on everybody would take those words seriously, I think it would have a huge impact on the number of kids that we identify and that we were able to then refer to resources. There's a whole list of warning signs, and these are things that people are specifically doing in the moment that indicate high risk. But the words that people are using is a huge one. Change in mood and affect, especially when talking about these things. Lack of sleep, all these things are really important things that you should be looking out for. I'll stop so the others can jump in here too.
Doreen, you want to add to that?
Yeah, I would echo everything that Jonathan said, and not kind of dismissing those as normal, quote unquote, adolescent behaviors, but really kind of looking beyond what's on the surface, particularly things like those verbal expressions, changes in mood. I'd also say changes in behavior. And I think, maybe contextualizing that a little bit for modern day. So, we talk a lot in suicide prevention about isolating, withdrawing, but, that might look like we may be looking at that in terms of social media for a kid, right? Who suddenly unfriends everybody or shuts down their social media platforms where they normally communicate, or blocks text, those sorts of things that say, I'm no longer connecting to the world around me. Paying attention to those behaviors, certainly if you get information that a student is searching, for ways to harm themselves, or taking more than a passing interest in things that connect to suicide. So I know the GoGuardian platform, we've spent a lot of time talking about that with the Beacon product, but, just really looking beyond what you see and not being afraid to question it. I think what Jonathan mentioned earlier about doing that not only in an age-appropriate developmental way, but also not being afraid to say, well, I'm not sure if this is something, but I take it seriously enough that I want to talk to you about it. And really having those conversations as proactively as you can is important. But all the things Jonathan mentioned, the other thing I would add maybe is onset of mental health issues. I don't think we can ignore how that many of our kids, our teens, are seeing their first onset, their first depressive episode in their school years. So just being mindful that that plays out differently for folks and what that looks like, but making sure that we're not ignoring the role of mental health, depression, anxiety, and all of those things in terms of suicide risk.
Yeah, I think we have time for one more question, perhaps. And I'm curious, I'm really curious what the answer is here. The question is, should parents connect their students' personal therapist to their school counselor? Sandy, maybe since you're the school counselor here in the room, maybe you could help us with this question.
Yes, that is very important. And hopefully they're not thinking that they have anything to hide, but that helps us to work together to see what the kids are going through within therapy, some of the strategies they have of dealing with things when they start to get escalated at school. It's important for us to know the language, all those types of things, the tools that the therapist is giving them. That's very important. And then we can share with the therapist what we're seeing happening at school. And so it is very important for us to be working together.
Absolutely.
And I want to emphasize what Sandy just said about the fact that the school counselor can share with the therapist. Schools are a unique environment for understanding what behaviors mean, right? What mood means. There is no better place to understand if a kid's being upset, if that is out of the norm or totally in the norm, right? Sandy can attest to this. There are days where it seems like everybody's crying, right, all day. And then there are other days where it's like people are just walking around in a fog. Like if you're in a school, you know that. But if you're the person that sees a kid once a week for an hour in your office, that doesn't make any sense.
Right.
We in the book Suicide in Schools, we've developed some tools that school staff can use to communicate with outpatient providers. And anything, whether it's from our book or any of the other programs that you have to be able to communicate this information, then you're building up that ecology of wellness that is essential in making sure that kids are not only staying alive, but they're having lives worth living.
Thank you for that. So actually, since we are reaching the end of our live stream here, I think it's really appropriate to end on a note of hope. I'm curious if you all could share with me and with our audience, today, what's giving you hope? In one breath or two. If you could just give us, what's giving you hope. Doreen, go ahead.
Like Jonathan, I started my career as a clinician in 1996. We graduated the same year. And one of the things I remember back then is it was hard to get schools to even talk about depression or even to talk about mental health proactively. And what gives me hope is that schools are being much more proactive. They're taking the time to develop policies around suicide prevention. And you see much more attention coming from schools, but also as a community at large. We're learning things every day that most people believe suicide is preventable. So that change in national conversation, I think, gives me tremendous hope.
Great. Jonathan, what's giving you hope?
Conversations like this.
Thank you.
That's what gives me hope. Yep.
Thank you so much. Sandy, one breath.
Oh, what's amazing is seeing these kids go through the Bionic team, then they come back, and then in the rest of their lives, they're learning those skills and they care and they want to make a difference. I could talk about Bionic all day, so thank you.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for being with us today. I know that it's a busy week. It's Suicide Prevention Week nationally and internationally. I know everyone has lots on their plate. And thank you to our audience for joining us. We know that this is a deep and very complex issue, so we congratulate you for joining us today. Please stay tuned. We will be sending out a recording to those who registered for this event, and we are excited to have more conversations just like this. So thank you so much, and thank you to our panelists. Everyone have a really good rest of your Suicide Prevention Week. Bye.
Bye.